If this quiet glimpse of Layla and the Gurban stirs you, please subscribe. Let each careful measure lull you towards sleep. Stay for more whispered histories. If this hush of history soothes you, subscribe gently for more midnight chronicles. Junior operator Mehmet Sami sat inside the Sakechi telegraph room, rubbing lemon balm into his fingers so they would glide across the brass key as rain beaded on the window panes and hissed whenever trams screeched past, while the lamp's thin wick perfumed the air with toasted linen. He penciled every signal into a blotter ruled down to quarter minutes, the graphite squeaking because the desk trembled atop loose floorboards, and his ears followed the staccato rhythm of distant hoofbeats outside, while his whole body leaned toward the sounder's dry clicks. At 14,007, the Gurban's call sign rattled through the line, Mehmet's thumb hovering mid-air, sweaty, tingling, refusing to strike again as he scraped away an incorrect dash, realizing that the Empire's neutrality still depended on a correction narrower than a fingernail. Hot copper smell rose from the relay coil, mingling with the brine carried through an open transom from the Golden Horn, and silence held meanwhile as he whispered the German syllables to himself, tasting unfamiliar vowels that felt like grit between teeth. When he finally transmitted the response promising coal and harbour, the sound seemed louder than cannon because it meant deliberate entanglement. Instead, the fatal mistake first appeared, not as strategy, but as a physical tremor that warped the spool, now revealing its frailty behind glass, though no one beyond that cramped room could sense it. 2 days earlier, War Minister Enver Pasha signed the secret alliance with Germany beneath a green-shaded lamp in Dolmabahce Palace, the bulb buzzing softly as Bosporus Tide tapped the key below. A German-made ruler lay beside the parchment, its centimetre marks shimmering with condensation because servants had just extinguished the stove. Enver compared casualty projections expressed in neatly printed columns, each digit suggesting that Prussian timetables could straighten Ottoman uncertainties. He ignored the smell of tar seeping from sailors' coats in the hallway, a reminder that logistics depended on more than neat handwriting. His fountain pen scratched across clove-oiled parchment, leaving grooves deep enough that later archivists could feel them through gloves. Outside, muezzins layered evening calls over the chug of passing steamers, yet inside the only sound was nib on paper. The treaty bound the Empire to strike Russia once Berlin clashed with St. Petersburg, a clause as cold as the ruler's nickel edge. Enver believed disciplined instruments would compensate for hungry battalions, even though Balkan war ledgers still glowed red with losses. He did not consider that warped telegraph spools and under-calibrated rangefinders might resist this imported precision. Thus the fatal mistake took legal form under lamplight, the scent of cloves mixing with ambition thicker than the Bosporus fog. Harbour Master Selim Galip watched the Gurban and Breslau glide through the Dardanelles on 10 August, their hulls grinding softly against the tide. He recorded that each vessel carried 1,500 tons of Welsh coal, the ledger pages sticking together from humid night air. Sparks from their funnels drifted down onto fishing boats, filling the harbour with a burnt sugar aroma that made onlookers cough. Selim felt the quayside tremble as German commands echoed between minarets, a foreign cadence sliding over Ottoman stone. Officials swore the ships were gifts, yet Selim noted the exact caliber of their 28-centimetre guns in the margin. Russian agents later copied those numbers, proving that the narrative of sovereign choice was already fraying. The townspeople sensed borrowed authority the moment sailors saluted in crisp Prussian style under the haze. Even the coal dust settling on Selim's cuffs carried a different texture, denser, glittering with unseen agreements. He felt history tilting while the sea lapped oily foam against his boots. Mist rises, ink cools, the Bosporus sighs, inviting a hush that tastes of iron and restless gulls. Further south at Çanakkale, engineer Ahmed Rustam recalibrated coastal rangefinders whose lenses had fogged with salt and pollen blown from pine groves. He sanded the glass with powdered pumice, scraping his knuckles until they smelled of blood and limestone. The device read 0.6 of a degree off true, meaning shells would land short unless he corrected each worn screw. His report requested replacement prisms from Krupp, yet Berlin delayed shipment until outstanding debts were cleared. Ahmed proposed hanging lantern chains along the shoreline at night to establish new reference points, a desperate improvisation. The memo disappeared into ministerial archives because cabinet meetings focused on diplomatic theatre rather than crooked instruments. Seawind rattled the telegraph poles while he packed his tools, aware that the Empire's defences now depended on guesswork. He licked salt from his lips and tasted failure before a single Allied ship appeared. Later, Allied shells exploited the misalignment he had measured so carefully. The fatal mistake therefore pulsed through screws, prisms, and sea mist that made numbers swim before the men sworn to trust them. Along the Anatolian Railway near Eskihir, Armenian inspector Aram Dilsizian lugged a portable scale along gravel that smelled of creosote and wild fennel. He weighed axle loads, translating ochre into kilograms as German howitzers rumbled onto flat cars. The brass weights clacked together like prayer beads, steady despite locomotives shrieking past. Aram noted that warped wooden sleepers would not carry the 8-ton pressure, and he underlined the warning twice. Telegrams begging for reinforcements sped toward Istanbul, yet no reply returned because wires elsewhere were monopolized by diplomatic traffic. Russian intelligence later confirmed those weak stretches and targeted them during the Sarikami campaign. Aram's calm handwriting outlived him, preserved in ledgers smelling of dust and rosewater. Each line pairs precise figures with a private dread that the Empire trusted foreign promises more than its own inspectors. He wondered whether Alliance glamour could mend cracked rails better than seasoned carpenters. The fatal mistake vibrated through those trembling sleepers long before icy Caucasian winds reached the trains. Inside Babakanlik's reading room, historian Yevket Torun lifted folded casualty returns from the First Balkan War, the paper flaking like dried pastry. The columns listed 34,152 rifles lost, 17,654 men missing, 987 horses dead from starvation. Each figure was stamped in violet ink, its metallic tang lingering on the fingertips of anyone who touched the page. Next to them lay Committee of Union and Progress memos promising German drills that would erase such deficits. These sheets had been withheld from public discussion simply because shame felt heavier than censorship. When Chevkot smoothed them under lamplight, dust glittered like embers rising from a battlefield pyre. He realized the myth of a rejuvenated army existed only because these brittle ledgers stayed folded. The evidence whispered that the fatal mistake began in the willful refusal to let data breathe. Outside, trams clanged along the sublime port, oblivious to the quiet avalanche of numbers inside. The archive smelled of starch and defeat, a sensory counter-argument to every triumphant speech. In Galata's marble headquarters, British clerk Edith Pennington tallied July 1914 customs receipts beneath buzzing arc lamps. Her ledger showed 1,275,000 Ottoman lira earmarked for foreign debt service, leaving 45,000 lira for emergency coal. She dusted chalk residue from exchange boards, the powder coating her cuffs like flour. Outside, Salep vendors stirred copper pots, their cinnamon steam wafting through open windows. Edith underlined the coal shortfall, imagining warships idling without fuel. Minutes later, a cable arrived suggesting mining the Dardanelles, yet the Treasury could barely finance extra anchors. She exhaled, hearing only the soft scrape of ledgers closing. Numbers, not myths, forecasted whether neutrality could hold, and the arithmetic already screamed no. Her report travelled to London, but Ottoman ministers never saw the warning. Silence here sprang from bureaucracy, a muffled fatal mistake measured in balance columns. Printer Hüseyin Kahet rotated lead type inside Tunin's buzzing press room, the air heavy with hot ink and scorched oil. He set a headline proclaiming Sultan Mehmed V's confident stride into destiny. German cable officers in the next room dictated which adjectives to emphasize. Typesetters wiped sweat onto newsprint, streaking their skin grey. Teacups rattled on crates as the presses shuddered. In the proof margin, someone penciled, "Verify with Enver," yet nobody dared delay. The distance between private doubt and public proclamation measured barely 2 centimeters on the galley. Readers inhaled fresh paper, believing sovereignty intact. Hussein stacked bundles while feeling the oily heat cling to his palms. The fatal mistake rode those vibrations out to the streets disguised as confidence. On the Black Sea, Admiral Wilhelm Souchon timed gunnery drills with a German stopwatch snapping at each 35-second cycle. Bosnian sailor Kemal Idris recorded 42 seconds instead, because stokers fasting for Ramadan moved slowly in suffocating casemates. Brass shell casings clanged onto wet decks, spraying salt and cordite aromas upward. Souchon barked that efficiency would save the empire, ignoring cultural rhythms steering his crews. Deck logs captured those seconds under skylights smeared with soot. When he ordered the raid on Odessa, his conviction rested on these adjusted figures, not parliamentary consent. Kemal felt the stopwatch weight heavier than any medal. He whispered a prayer, tasting coal dust on his tongue. The fatal mistake tightened around obedience to imported metronomes rather than human breath. Cedar creaks, lanterns dim, the sea inhales old smoke before exhaling silence across the rail. In Tiflis, archivist Vera Nikitina filed decoded intercepts proving Ottoman involvement in the Odessa raid. She slid the papers into camphor-scented folders while snow glare turned ink bluish. Her fingers warmed over a samovar before annotating the dates, 29 October and 1 November. The file's title, Ottoman Fatal Miscalculation, was stamped in black wax. Vera understood that history would now classify the empire as aggressor. She paused, listening to sleigh bells outside, and felt distant gunfire within the words. The intercept left no room for myth about coercion. Russia's declaration emerged from her quiet notation rather than canon. Her diary later revealed sorrow for the clerks who sparked catastrophe. Evidence, smelling of camphor and ink, had already sealed the fatal mistake. In London's Admiralty chart room, Lieutenant Julian Layard traced the Dardanelles depths with chilled fingertips. He compared 1906 Ottoman mine maps with submarine reports that arrived late via Athens. The parchment carried a tang of shellac and seawater. Layard penciled a plan for naval forcing alone, trusting thin defences would buckle. He never tasted Gallipoli's grit or heard pebbles clicking under Ottoman boots. His memorandum, clipped with brass fasteners, triggered the Allied gamble. The fatal mistake gained adversaries confident in outdated charts. Layard's pencil left indentations still visible today. Strategic imagination ignored the living terrain. Cables shiver, graphite dulls, dawn fog slips between compass roses, urging a listening breath tonight. During the March bombardment, spotter Gulsanur Kaya climbed Romelli Masidier's ladder, boots thudding on damp planks. Her field glasses smelled of oil vapor, and gusts blew limestone dust into her mouth. She logged shell splashes every 15 seconds, adjusting for wind. Tears smeared the ink when blasts shook the tower. Because she was a woman in combat, the General Staff buried her notebook. In 1987, the diary resurfaced at an estate sale. Readers finally saw how data and emotion intertwined atop those cliffs. Gulsanur wrote that the fatal mistake forced her to prove modern competence no canon could guarantee. Her handwriting loops like waves, evidence dampened by survival. Suppression here grew from institutional discomfort rather than strategy. Across no man's land, Australian sapper Thomas Weir crept through scrub, with a clinometer clanking against his belt. He smelled eucalyptus oil from a leaf tucked in his pocket. The instrument measured trench angles at 28 degrees, ensuring periscope rifles cleared parapets. His field sketch mapped Ottoman ricochets in careful pencil hatching. Letters home described muezzin calls drifting over gunsmoke like lullabies. Each measurement convinced him defenders fought for pride more than policy. He tasted grit blown against his teeth while tightening the clinometer screw. Thomas wondered whether numbers could capture why an empire risked everything simply to refuse humiliation. The fatal mistake thus appeared to allies as stubborn heroism. His notes still smell faintly of cordite and eucalyptus when archives unbox them. In April 1915, Interior Minister Talat dictated deportation directives to Cipher Officer Hassan Tassin inside a room thick with leather and dust. Ceiling fans rattled, spreading warm air scented like old saddles. Code Circular 86A2 specified rail capacities, caravan staging posts, grain allotments per 100 deportees. Hassan's pencil squeaked, encoding distances between Sivas and the Euphrates crossings. His diary, sealed for decades, confessed fear that fronts would starve without Armenian labourers. Here the fatal mistake mutated into internal purges that drained logistics. Clerks burned drafts to avoid implication, leaving only crisp cipher sheets. The room's stagnant air tasted of copper and dread. Silence stemmed from terror rather than strategy. Numbers that might have saved soldiers instead choreographed suffering. Snow crushed Sarakamine valleys, where medic Zekiye Alte thawed morphine ampoules over a guttering candle. She recorded body temperatures dropping below 34 degrees, the thermometer's mercury freezing mid-column. Blankets reeked of smoke and sweat, and steam stung her eyes. German advisors had demanded a winter offensive despite local scouts' warning of blizzards. Zekiye's logbook was walled up in Erzurum, rediscovered only in 2003. The damp pages fused together, smelling of mouldy sweetness. Her entries proved that weather, not valor, slaughtered 60,000 men. Suppression owed to collapse, not censorship, yet understanding was delayed. The fatal mistake rippled inland as railways clogged with corpses instead of reinforcements. Embers settle, breath frosts, the plateau whispers through chapped lips for patient remembrance tonight alone. Along the Hijaz Railway, Bedouin leader Auda Abu Tayi counted bolt spacing before planting charges. British liaison T.E. Lawrence noted the rails rang like tuning forks when struck. Ottoman commander Farooq Sami stationed guards every 500 meters. Desert heat warped joints until they smelled of burnt tar. Sabotage thus required only a wrench, no explosive. The fatal mistake's reach extended to every far-flung artery. Lawrence's gelignite receipts remained speckled with sand grains. Newspapers in Istanbul barely mentioned the revolt, hoping silence could deny it. The desert wind carried metallic dust into sentries' mouths. Dependency on total war exposed the empire to nicks that bled it dry. In Beirut, American relief worker Sarah Jesse weighed flour rations on creaking scales. Harbour air smelled of stale cumin and seawater. Her log listed only 80 grams of bread per child. Ottoman requisitions seized coastal grain for the Fourth Army. Children's whispers mingled with rumbling submarines offshore. Governor Jamal insisted shortages were temporary. His requisition orders, however, bore precise tonnages, proving the opposite. Sarah's reports were censored upon arrival in Istanbul. Famine became another facet of the fatal mistake. Silence tasted of salt and guilt. When Bulgaria quit the war in 1918, Quartermaster Halil Nakati tallied cartridges under a flickering lamp. Rain leaked through the barracks roof, soaking crates stamped with German serial numbers. He counted only 1.2 million rounds for entire Thrace fronts. Halil circled the number twice, pressing so hard the nib tore the ledger. The room smelled of damp wool and despair. He compared the total with casualty forecasts, realizing a month more would empty every depot. These ledgers later proved the army defeated before Mudros. Halil noted that the fatal mistake began with ignoring such columns early. His chair scraping stone sounded like a flag dragging in gravel. He closed the book, knowing arithmetic had already ordered surrender. During Mehmed VI's girding ceremony, palace silversmiths weighed the sword of Osman at 406 dirhams. Incense of rose petals and beeswax filled the hall, masking Bosporus damp. Courtiers whispered legends of instant revival. The new sultan's palms sweated, so aides wrapped the hilt in silk. Electric bulbs buzzed above, drowning whispered prayers. Casualty numbers flashed on nearby telegraph tapes, ignored during the rite. The ritual's gravity could not counter blockade arithmetic. Myth and measurement collided in that gilded chamber. No one dared mention German officers still commanding the fleet. Reverence enforced silence, even as the fatal mistake crystallized. Aboard HMS Agamemnon, negotiator Ralph Orbay signed the Armistice of Mudros under a swinging lamp. The document's 25 clauses gleamed with fresh ink. Article 16 granted Allies access to every Ottoman communication line. Coal smoke and salt flavored the air as the ship rocked gently. Ralph requested leniency regarding the straits. Admiral Calthorpe pointed instead to casualty graphs towering in red. The fatal mistake ended in clauses more than canon. Ralph pocketed the pen, sticky with ink, as if dignity could be folded away. Outside, waves slapped the hull like impatient hands. Inside, autonomy evaporated quietly. When Allied troops entered Istanbul in 1909, photographer Saber Joannis set his plate camera on cobbles softened by rain. He measured shutter speeds at 1/20th of a second to capture Scottish pipers marching past veiled women. Bread baskets smelled of damp yeast as French sailors inspected telegraph offices. Sensors briefly seized the negatives to limit humiliation. Sabre stored them in cedar boxes perfumed with resin. Decades later, the prints resurfaced, showing the fatal mistake's visual fingerprints. Discovery, suppression, and rediscovery curved once more through cedar-scented darkness. The images revealed quays where empire surrendered to documentation. Even puddles reflected bayonets like thin shards of judgment. Brass glitters, drums fade, gulls wheel through drizzle, urging the city to breathe once more before answering. At the 1919 courts, Marshal, Judge Mustafa Arif, presided beneath chandeliers dimmed by coal braziers. Stenographers clacked Remington keys that sounded like muffled hammers. Witnesses cited telegram numbers, dates, casualty figures. Transcripts smelled of vinegar from ink fixer. Sentences were issued in absentia against fugitives. Mustafa added reflective notes, lamenting decisions made faster than consultation. He argued that the fatal mistake was a chain, not a single blow. Yet the new regime preferred scapegoats to structural critiques. Gavels knocked hollow on braided carpets. Justice exhaled, but never quite inhaled again. When Greek troops landed at Smyrna in 1909, journalist Halide Sadiai sketched from a jasmine-draped balcony. Drums rolled, their echoes bouncing off warehouse walls. She counted 3,000 soldiers marching within 20 minutes. Bayonets glittered under a bleached sun while priests chanted. Crushed figs from market stalls perfumed the humid air. Halide wrote that the fatal mistake had invited occupiers speaking different promises. Her notes were smuggled on rice paper beneath embroidered shawls. British censors seized most editions, delaying publication until the Republic. The crowd's silence mixed awe with dread. Cobblestones vibrated under synchronized boots, imprinting memory onto stone. At San Remo, cartographer Henry Laurent unfolded silk-backed maps dividing Ottoman provinces. His protractors sliced territories with surgical precision. Coffee and cigar smoke mingled with sea breeze. He annotated oil fields near Mosul, grain routes along the Euphrates. Ottoman diplomats never saw his margin notes predicting revolts. The French Foreign Ministry locked the files until 1972. Discovery, suppression, and rediscovery looped again. Henri's ink stains remain on the silk like bruises. The fatal mistake allowed outsiders to measure the empire more ruthlessly than it measured itself. The rustle of maps sounded like distant waves cutting shorelines. In Anatolia, resistance leader Kara Fatma counted cartridges by candlelight inside a barn smelling of hay. She noted which villages contributed mules, blankets, or cornmeal. Her ledger mapped supply pulses through mountain paths. Soot from the chimney flecked the pages like night sky. She framed the fatal mistake as trusting foreign clocks over local rhythms. Operational secrecy enforced whispers instead of proclamations. Each figure carried both logistical weight and reflective warning. Cold stiffened her fingers, so she wrapped them in wool. The candle guttered, painting orange halos on the ledger. Future Republicans revered her handwriting as evidence that survival required listening to grassroots measurements. When nationalist forces re-entered Smyrna, medic Levin Artinian catalogued casualties inside a tobacco warehouse. Cured leaves and ash thickened the air. He tallied burns, gunshots, smoke inhalation cases under carbide lamps. More civilians than soldiers filled his stretcher lists. Allied observers confiscated several pages to control narratives. His granddaughter later donated the surviving ledger to an Izmir museum. Edges crumble when touched, releasing nicotine scent. Levon wrote that the fatal mistake spawned cycles of vengeance, each measured in charred beams. Rescuers paused often to listen for muffled breaths under debris. Silence felt reverent, not empty. During the Treaty of Lausanne, Nunu set a slide rule beside his teacup. Open windows admitted pine-scented Swiss air. He read clauses ending capitulations and confirming sovereignty. Spectacles fogged as he computed population exchanges. Porcelain cups clinked between arguments. He knew the fatal mistake had already buried the Ottoman polity he was reshaping. Margin notes recorded tariff percentages with meticulous care. The session's transcripts show silence whenever Ottoman myths surfaced. Discovery, suppression, and rediscovery closed another loop as empire became preface to republic. Pines sway, pens rest, mountaintops glow, and the conference room breathes in measured relief before night. In the 1930s, historian Ahmed Rafiq catalogued confiscated CUP files in a chalky Ankara basement. Limosh flakes dusted his shoulders, making him sneeze. He wore cotton gloves smelling of soap. Telegram bundles still held sticky red wax seals. Ahmed traced the chronology from alliance to capitulation. His books framed the fatal mistake as ethical failure. He illuminated neglected data with lamplight metaphors. Yet he omitted testimonies to protect living officials. The basement's chill seeped into his joints. History's weight numbed like winter wind. In 1942, curator Semiletin Arsoy reopened the Naval Museum cases to catalogue wartime artifacts before possible bombing. He measured the telegraph spool with a new micrometer, confirming the 1.7mm warp. Steel jaws felt icy against his wrist. The room smelled of wax polish and aged velvet. Oxidation had darkened the copper to dried blood tones. He filed a report urging better humidity control. He understood the fatal mistake, still magnetized attention, warning that neglected maintenance returns as history. This rediscovery completed another loop, cautioning a republic entering fresh global wars. Sirens wailed outside as he breathed on the glass, leaving a brief fog. He wondered whether leaders would heed tactile warnings, while the artifact pulsed quietly like a hidden metronome. In 1957, Professor Niazi Burks interviewed surviving telegraphists inside smoky Ankara tea gardens. Cold-brewed say perfumed his notebooks. He asked veterans to recall the tempo of taps during August afternoons. One described enamel chipping off the key when orders arrived to fire on Russia. The Grundig recorder whirred beside clinking glasses. These testimonies supplied timestamps contradicting official communiques. Niazi reflected that the fatal mistake lived inside bodily rushes overruling caution. Political sensitivities almost shelved the recordings. They survived because a secretary loved the background zither. The tapes crackle like distant telegraph lines whenever replayed. Archaeologist Sevim Onaren excavated Chunut Bear in 1964, brushing sand scented with wild thyme. She unearthed shrapnel balls, water canteens, and a rusted German stopwatch frozen at 00,035. The stopwatch matched Admiral Souchon's drill tempo. Sevim logged coordinates using a transit that clicked softly in the Aegean breeze. Her report argued that imported regimens persisted even where terrain defied them. Bureaucrats sidelined the study for 8 years. Trench layers waited in silence, smelling of rust and herbs. Publication in 1972 finally linked mechanical confidence to the fatal mistake. Sevim kept the stopwatch's faint ticking in her memory. Excavation tents flapped like fatigued banners above the ridge. In 1978, filmmaker Atshef Yilmaz interviewed retired nurse Sabiha Hanim in a kerosene-scented apartment. She unfolded linen bandages saved from Sarikami. They still held smoky odors of melted snow and pine resin. On camera, she described thermometers shattering at -25 degrees. Her recollection tied sensory pain to the fatal mistake. Censors deemed the footage too bleak. Reels stored in a shoebox stuck together when a studio pipe burst. Restorers later peeled them apart, preserving the crackle of her voice. The soundtrack's hiss resembles distant ice. Her testimony now plays softly in museum alcoves. When archives opened wider in 1983, researcher Ai Kansu donned cotton gloves and turned cipher office registers under fluorescent hum. She tracked telegram number 1183, ordering Black Sea raids before parliamentary debate. Pages smelled of vinegar and dust. Each crackle felt like a bone resettling. Ai's article argued the fatal mistake was a chain of mismatched minutes. Officials worried the study might fuel lawsuits. The paper circulated quietly among scholars. Silence lingered, born of diplomatic caution. Yet the documents kept breathing through citations. Fluorescents hum, dust dances. The archive exhales a slow patience, wrapping facts in cool breath tonight. In 1994, diver Hakan Demiriyurek surveyed the Dardanelles seabed near the wreck of submarine E-15. Bioluminescent plankton flickered like lanterns around his helmet. He found dormant Ottoman mines stamped with German serial numbers. Water tasted metallic through his regulator. He measured spacing between mines, realizing foreign ordnance guarded home waters. His video captured taps of tools against corroded brass. Officials delayed release, fearing diplomatic ripples. The footage finally appeared in a museum exhibit. Currents kept whispering along the mines, even in darkness. Dependency had followed the empire underwater, echoing the fatal mistake. In 2002, archivist Meltem Çelik fed fragile telegrams into a scanner emitting high-pitched whines. The documents smelled of camphor and inkstone. She monitored humidity to prevent further warping. Digitization allowed researchers to trace the fatal mistake minute by minute. A budget cut nearly shut the servers down. Hard drives sat silent in the dark for months. When funds returned, the machines hummed like distant surf. Meltem logged metadata linking timestamps to battle outcomes. She reflected that the 1.7mm warp now existed as pixels. Digital light carried the same warning as copper under glass. In 2011, artist Selin Ararat suspended copper wires bent by 1.7mm inside a dim gallery. Solder scented the air while visitors walked through loops shimmering like signal waves. Recorded telegraph codes translated into lullabies whispered from concealed speakers. Authentic Allied reports scrolled beside reflective poetry. Docents invited guests to pluck the wires, hearing dull twangs. Critics argued the installation reopened imperial wounds. Selin replied that reverent silence must give way to tactile engagement. Each arc embodied the fatal mistake as tension you could feel. Light pooled on the floor like mercury. Audiences left with copper dust glittering on their sleeves. During the 2014 centennial, scholars met at the German embassy in Ankara under polished oak beams. Coffee and cardamom cookies perfumed the room. Historian Klaus Ritter projected microfilmed cables urging Ottoman strikes on Russia. Turkish scholar Zeynep Aksoy responded with Sarıkama casualty tables. The projector hummed while pale light washed across thoughtful faces. Debate centered on whether coercion or hubris defined the fatal mistake. Participants noted misaligned clocks, 14,003 Berlin, 15,035 Istanbul. Soft shoes creaked on parquet as they paced between easels. Shared reckoning replaced earlier mutual flattery. Outside, embassy fountains murmured like distant Morse. During the 2016 coup attempt, journalist S.A. Olgan broadcast from a dim newsroom powered by emergency generators. The air smelled of overheated circuitry. She held a replica of the warped spool while whispering about misread loyalties. Monitors beeped softly behind her. Issei described the metallic tang left on her fingertips. She linked past and present fatal mistakes through that tactile bridge. Viewers heard keyboards clicking like subdued telegraphs. Studio lights cast halos on the copper's bruise. She ended without sensationalism, letting silence carry weight. The broadcast reminded millions that minute measurements can topple colossal ambitions. In 2018, mathematician Rana Sagan modelled Ottoman logistics using archival figures. Her lab smelled of whiteboard markers and warm circuits. Software chimed whenever a scenario failed, which was often. Rana mixed equations with essays on ethical prediction, arguing the fatal mistake started when leadership dismissed analysts like her predecessors. She wiped chalk dust from her hands, feeling grit shared with telegraph tables. Funding agencies initially shelved her preprint. Eventually the study emerged, showing shortages within weeks regardless of optimism. She wondered whether modern states truly heed their data. Silence here arose from prideful hesitation. Chalk settles, code hums, midnight fluorescents pulse, and the lab exhales a thin, listening hush tonight. During the 2020 lockdown, curator Derya Aksu checked humidity inside the Naval Museum while ferries honked across an empty Bosporus. Disinfectant and sea salt perfumed the silent hall. She placed digital hygrometers beside the telegraph display. The glass fogged briefly when she breathed on it. Derya whispered the measurements: 50% relative humidity, 20 degrees Celsius. She believed the fatal mistake taught curators to honor tiny thresholds. Outside, gulls replaced traffic noise. The copper seemed to glow under diffuse skylight. She recorded readings in a leather notebook. She imagined the spool inhaling the hush like lungs. In 2021, teacher Murat Sezer streamed lessons from his apartment while rain tapped the window. Projector light washed pale rectangles across his bookshelves. He shared 3D scans of Ottoman documents with students muted on screen. Murat overlaid Morse beeps beneath his narration to keep them grounded in sound. He zoomed in on the 1.7mm warp, tracing it with a cursor. Chat bubbles blossomed silently as students sent reflections. He paired casualty graphs with meditations about responsibility. Fresh coffee scented the room, mixing with ozone from electronics. He insisted that trusting measurements over legend might prevent future fatal mistakes. The lesson ended with a still frame glowing like an ember. Composer Yasemin Ertan transformed telegraph logs into a minimalist score inside an abandoned power station. Rust and damp concrete scented the cavernous hall. She assigned each measured interval a bell tone recorded at midnight. Whispered testimonies floated between notes, creating an ASMR-like hush. Audience members reclined on cushions feeling low-frequency vibrations. Projections of documents drifted across the ceiling. Yasemin described the fatal mistake as a dissonant chord never resolving. The final bell faded into darkness. Silence afterwards felt awed rather than empty. Dust motes spun through stage light like slow snow. During the 2023 centennial, guide Orhan Yalchin led visitors through a fiber optic corridor tracing Ottoman timelines. Cedar and old paper perfumed the passage. He paused before the spool, now paired with casualty graphs and diplomatic cables. Soft heartbeat audio pulsed beneath his voice. Orhan asked guests to imagine the metallic taste of copper on the tongue. Footsteps muffled on felt runners. He linked measurements, rail kilometers, coal tons, frost degrees, to the fatal mistake. No one asked questions. The cadence felt complete, yet unresolved. Gulls cried faintly beyond the windows. The story lingered like incense. Engineer Pellinada coated replica artifacts with responsive polymers in a lab smelling of solder and citrus cleanser. Gloves embedded with sensors relayed pressure data to humming servers. She programmed the telegraph spool's 1.7mm dip so users could feel the slump through fingertips. Touchscreens glowed blue as participants traced invisible histories. Pellin argued that memory must remain bodily to prevent new fatal mistakes. Funding proposals cited earlier cycles of suppression. Each test produced a faint buzz like distant Morse. She smiled whenever visitors flinched at the unexpected texture. The lab lights reflected off copper surfaces like small suns. Future historians will literally grasp the warning. Philosopher Elif Sarahan taught a twilight seminar called Metrics of Collapse on a campus lawn glistening with dew. Crickets trilled around the benches. She projected spreadsheets beside poems by Yahya Kemal. Students traced graphs with fingers before journaling reflections. Elif framed the fatal mistake as a refusal to hear instruments already whispering fatigue. They doodled warped spirals in the margins. Notebooks smelled of rain-damp paper. She urged them to balance empirical warning with lyrical empathy. Bells from a distant chapel drifted through trees. Bells distant, pages rustle, campus shadows thicken, and the seminar breathes as night gathers around attentive ears. Each autumn, Bosporus ferry captain Murad Gurksi charts winter timetables with pencil marks that smudge in diesel warmth. A replica spool sits on his dashboard. Foghorns bellow while gulls wheel overhead. Murad matches each horn blast to archival timestamps he memorized. Passengers sip hot salep, their breath clouding windows. He murmurs the Empire's decisive dates under his breath. He believes steering requires listening to hull vibrations as much as radar. He tells trainees that forgetting those vibrations echoes the fatal mistake that once warped the Empire's bearings. Copper's metallic scent mingles with coffee in the cabin. Night lights smear across the current like ink, and the city feels suspended between caution and yearning. Now the warped spool rests beneath amber light, copper scent lingering even through sealed glass. Visitors lean close enough to fob the case, watching their reflections skim across the metal's bruise. All the measurements we traced, coal tonnage, axle loads, thermometer readings, humidity percentages, seem to spiral toward that 1.7mm dip. Legends still whisper of an empire destined to endure, yet the artifact insists destiny can bend like soft wire. Evidence gathered by operators, engineers, nurses, sailors, archivists, artists, and teachers continues to press gently against nostalgia. Discovery, suppression, and rediscovery keep looping, as though the story prefers murmurs to verdicts. Every sensory fragment, salted wind, oiled leather, time on trench walls, ozone around projectors, threads through the question of why leaders trust myths more than instruments. Perhaps the fatal mistake remains unfinished, a companionable ghost reminding each listener to feel data as texture, temperature, rhythm. We stand in the hush, hearing imagined clicks drift through the room like distant rain. The sand remembers, instruments hum, the hollow waits, and night drapes copper in a hush beyond certainty. A few steps from the copper case, Conservator Layla carefully unrolled a fresh mylar sleeve, its crinkling whisper mingling with the steady hum of the dehumidifier, and slid out a faded ration chit stamped 1914, its violet ink smelling faintly of sun-warmed grapes. The chit promised 4 ockers of coal to a coastal watchpost near Kumkali, yet the reverse bore a small grease stain where a sentinel had pressed his thumb after counting only 2. The discrepancy is barely measurable. A half-gram of missing fuel oil shimmer absorbed into porous paper, but the tension ripples forward. In the same box, Layla found the watchpost's log penciled in soot, remarking that the men burned signal flags just to brew tea. Those ashes fluttered over the strait like premature surrender. The fatal mistake thus rests inside promises trimmed by necessity, a whispering shortage that left artillery crews blinking in the cold, while envoys boasted about unlimited reserves. The paper still crackles when unfolded, each fibre carrying the scent of singed wool. Down the hill at the Imperial School of Engineering, barometric technician Musa Hacker once calibrated aneroid gauges by candlelight because the dynamo had failed, the flame breathing resinous scent against the brass diaphragms. Musa's surviving notebook, pages browned like toasted pastry, reveals he subtracted 0.4 millimeters from every storm warning. Because German manuals insisted on a sea level baseline, never adjusted for Istanbul's humid microclimate. In the autumn of 1914, those slight errors delayed gale alerts to troop transports threading the Bosporus, and 2 barges packed with artillery horses capsized near Kandili. The animals' panicked whinnies echoed through the fog like torn silk, persuading dockworkers that something more than weather had shifted. Musa later scratched a remorseful note in the margin, should have trusted the window frost, and the graphite smudge still glints under archival lamps. The fatal mistake here crept in on chilled air, disguised as meticulous conformity. In Damascus, stargazer Selime Ferhan pointed a brass sextant from a rooftop observatory scented with wild jasmine and baking flatbread. She logged lunar distances to refine telegraph synchronization between Aleppo and Medina, her ink shimmering blue-black under kerosene glow. Her tables, stored inside a cedar chest, show widening gaps after August 1914. Ottoman operators were instructed to privilege Berlin's master clock, even when the desert sky insisted on another rhythm. The cumulative drift reached 6 minutes by October, causing relief trains to misalign with water deliveries along the Hijaz Railway. Camel troughs dried before caravans arrived, and the taste of dust thickened on soldiers' tongues. Selime wrote that stars were ignored, as though loyalty could bend constellations. Her quiet protest, scrawled on the back of a lunar diagram, survives because a lizard egg hardened against the page and preserved it. The fatal mistake thus extended across celestial calculations, where obedience eclipsed observation. Archivist Dimitrios Kotsakis, stationed in the Greek-dominated port of Epilogue, catalogued seized Ottoman dispatches within a warehouse perfumed by olive presses and brine. He wore cotton gloves slick with lamp oil as he unfolded parchment orders detailing emergency levies of sponge divers to lift British mines. Margins carried smudged fingerprints from harbour masters who knew their divers had fled when Greek scouts appeared offshore. Dimitrios added annotations in pencil, describing crates left uncollected and bells rusting on piers. Those pencil strokes, musty with olive dust, reveal that by 1917, the Empire's maritime lifelines were already skeletal, held together by requisitions nobody could fulfill. His ledger ends mid-sentence, interrupted by the morning call to evacuate before Allied troops arrived. Yet that unfinished line impeccably captures the fatal mistake, logistics dreamed on paper but never touched by hands accustomed to salt and rope. Deep inside Konya's Khan, camel-born postal inspector Fatma Diyar unfolded waxed envelopes that resisted opening because desert heat had fused their edges, releasing a tart odour like sun-baked figs. She verified route stamps by brushing talcum over them, the powder rising in soft clouds. Her report from October 1914 lists 27 missing mailbags containing tax receipts earmarked for Anatolian depots. The bags had been diverted by local militias trading grain for rifles, a barter the Central Treasury refused to acknowledge. Fatma stitched her report into the lining of her cloak, leaving it for her sister in Ankara. The thread now frays inside an ethnography exhibit, silently attesting to fiscal arteries collapsing far from the straits. The fatal mistake, therefore, also belongs to these stolen mailbags, to powdery seal impressions ignored by ministers who craved grand alliances more than dusty receipts. In Sivas, meteorologist Levon Marashian, whose beard always carried the scent of pine resin, plotted temperature gradients on a glass pane frosted by his breath. He lacked coloured inks, so he used diluted beet juice, which dried into translucent maroon veins across the contour map. His December 1914 bulletin warned that the Doshu Anadolu Plateau would dip to -30 within days, urging a halt to the planned encirclement of Sarikamoy. The warning travelled by sled to Erzurum, where it met a snowdrift that soaked the paper until the beet pigments bled into a sunset blur. General Hafez Hakizade noted the smudged colours but could not decipher the figures, and the army marched anyway. Levin's original glass pane survives, its etched isolines crisp as icicles. When museum light grazes those grooves, you can almost feel the cold radiate outward. The fatal mistake glistens there, frozen between notation and comprehension. Meanwhile, at the Ottoman Mint across the Golden Horn, assayer Rushtu Tevfik heated gold sovereigns under a spirit lamp scented with citrus peel to test for adulteration. War loans demanded precise alloys, yet the German advisors insisted on accelerating the assay process to triple daily output. Ritu's solution, chipped at the rim from haste, made the scale pans quiver. He began approving coins that rang dull when struck. Within weeks, merchants refused the brittle lira, and the bazaar filled with a metallic smell of mistrust. The mint ledger records each rejected coin with a tiny dot of vermilion lacquer, now faded to dusty rose. Those dots cluster around dates when political speeches promised unwavering stability. Commerce had already listened and objected. The fatal mistake diffused through coinage, clinking softly from purse to counter as credibility thinned. On the fringes of the Sinai frontier, cartographer Miriam al-Husseini sketched dune lines by moonlight, using a camel vertebra as a straight edge because her metal ruler seared skin during the day. Her maps depict wells with circles of cobalt pigment, yet after the German-Turkish expedition rerouted water to railheads, several wells dried to sour puddles. She added faint grey crosshatches over them, a cartographic sigh. The expedition commanders refused to update their master charts, believing the British would be deterred by outdated obstacles. Miriam's scroll, brittle and smelling of myrrh, shows the real terrain surrendering even as strategy clung to illusion. When the document resurfaced in 1999, restorers discovered grains of sand embedded in the pigment, minute glittering testimonies to a landscape misheard. The fatal mistake wandered through those dunes, slipping between arrogance and thirst. Inside Edirne's military hospital, pharmacist Nasiye Fevzi distilled disinfectant from lavender harvested on campus lawns, the scent hovering sweet and medicinal. She logged bottle counts with a chronograph borrowed from an artillery officer, each tick echoing across tiled corridors. Supply trains seldom arrived, so she diluted ethanol to stretch the stock. Her log from January 1915 notes that a shipment meant for Gallipoli was instead diverted to a private warehouse in Thessaloniki as collateral for munitions. Nasiye underlined the diversion 3 times, the ink pooling where her hand trembled from working double shifts. Those underlined grooves gouged the page even now, conveying strain more eloquently than any speech. Infection rates spiked, and the hospital's copper basins filled with cloth steeped in lavender water too weak to sterilize. The fatal mistake seeped through these wards as microbes and misallocation, softly humming with the ticking chronograph. In Vienna's Hofburg archives, Austrian diplomat Franz Niedermeyer compiled a confidential memorandum assessing his Ottoman counterpart's readiness. He dipped his pen into green ink smelling faintly of menthol to stave off headaches. The memo catalogued missed appointments, unpaid telegraph fees, fraying uniforms, and an atmosphere he described as perfumed confidence against a backdrop of mold. He appended attachments, photographs of cracked barracks floors, audio cylinders capturing officers assuring him that the Prophet will shield the coal, and invoices for champagne served during strategy luncheons. This dossier, stamped Geheim, was shelved behind carved oak panels until 1959. When opened, the wax seal exhaled a dusty sweetness. The memo shows that allies saw the fatal mistake forming yet still encouraged the plunge, hoping to tie Ottoman fate to their own calculus. Menthol-scented ink lines thus bind complicity to catastrophe. At the Chile automobile repair yard, Mechanic twins Semil and Semili Uz, their aprons smelling of petrol and honey buns, refitted cavalry wagons with truck axles scavenged from Berlin shipments. Their ledger describes bolts stripped by sand, grease diluted with sunflower oil, and horsehair padding stuffed into gearboxes to quiet rattles. They sent photographs, sepia-smudged, edges curling like burnt pastry, to the War Ministry, pleading for proper parts. The reply, typed on onion skin, praised their ingenuity and asked for a public demonstration to inspire morale. The demonstration never took place. The wagons collapsed en route to the parade ground when improvised axles snapped above a pothole. The ledger ends with a simple line: sound mattered more than stride. That soft observation, scored into oil-streaked paper, reveals the fatal mistake as a decision to showcase resilience rather than strengthen it. In the Crimean port of Sevastopol, Russian cryptographer Olga Putintseva noted that Ottoman cipher groups increasingly reused keys, their parchment dampened by sea spray. She tasted salt when she licked her finger to turn the pages, a habit she later regretted when the ink stained her lips. The repetition allowed her to decode supply requests for Anatolia, revealing desperate pleas for winter coats and quinine. Olga's handwritten translation, still crisp beneath glass, lists coordinates of depots that soon suffered sabotage. She included a delicate watercolour of the Black Sea at dusk, perhaps to steady herself. The fatal mistake emerges even here. In enemy hands ready to exploit patterns born of fatigue, the Empire's overtaxed clerks could not afford fresh keys, and so the code itself became a leak. Within the Ottoman state printing house, proofreader Zechariah Talat ran fingertips along newly etched maps of the Caucasus, the zinc plates still warm and smelling of vinegar and tin. He caught a mislabeled ridge and corrected it with a burnished stylus, yet he hesitated before marking the misplacement of Armenian villages slated for deportation routes. The orders specified emptiness there, but his childhood memories insisted otherwise. He recorded both versions on tracing paper, layering absence over reality. The translucent sheets crackled gently now, stacked on a shelf. Later investigators used them to prove deliberate erasures. Zechariah's complicit care shows the fatal mistake, knotting moral surrender to technical diligence, a quiet interplay of stylus, vinegar, and conscience. In an Aleppo caravanserai, spice merchant turned informant Yusuf Haddad brewed cardamom coffee that perfumed British agent Gertrude Bell's notebooks. Yusuf described grain seizures, telegraph outages, and desertion rumours, passing along scraps of ledger paper he salvaged from abandoned depots. Bell's diary summarises his whispers, emphasising the tremor in his teacup whenever he recounted soldiers selling boots for tobacco. She pasted a coffee-stained slip beside her entry, noting the exact phrasing. The wires hum like bees but carry honey to someone else. The slip's edges darkened over time, yet the scent remains faintly sweet in the archive. The fatal mistake thus resonates even in informant's metaphors, saturating the air of places where loyalty frayed into survival. Back in Istanbul's sublime port, translator Shushan Harutyan carefully rephrased German memoranda into Ottoman Turkish while breathing in the musk of damp carpets and inkstones. She wore a wool shawl woven with pomegranate motifs, the fibres catching lamp soot. Her desk drawers hid miniature notebooks filled with her own annotations, termed strategic necessities deployed 14 times today, cull figure repeated despite correction, voices lower when casualties mentioned. These marginalia, no longer than a fingernail, were tucked into a lacquer box sealed with beeswax. When unearthed decades later, the wax still smelled faintly of honey and smoke. The notes transform bureaucratic chatter into tactile evidence of collective denial, each tally of euphemisms another thread in the fatal mistake's shroud. Inside a Thessaloniki synagogue repurposed as a depot, Quartermaster Isaac Haleva inventoried uniforms stacked against Torah Ark doors. Mothballs and candle wax scented the air. He recorded that German-made boots shrank when exposed to Aegean humidity, blistering conscripts' feet. His receipts bear brown smudges from iodine used to treat those blisters. Isaac mailed photographs of rotted leather to Istanbul, but censorship intercepted them. The negatives remained rolled inside a tallit bag until the 1970s, when descendants donated them to a museum. The images show boots peeling like wet bark, arrayed beneath coffins awaiting transport. The fatal mistake gnaws quietly through leather and ritual alike, leaving wax, iodine, and mildew as its wake. At the Hodeidah telegraph relay, Yemeni operator Amina Saka kept time using a silver pocket watch inherited from her mother, scented with frankincense stored in the same pouch. When German advisors delivered a modern chronometer, its ticking felt too fast for the drowsy heat. Amina's log reveals she gradually reverted to the inherited watch, adjusting the chronometer's readings with handwritten offsets. Her margins note, "Heat stretches seconds. Berlin does not sweat here." Yet command insisted on standardized times, so eventually her corrections were deemed insubordination. She was reassigned to inventorying batteries, a quieter exile. The logbook, edges singed from nearby kerosene lamps, attests to an empire unwilling to reconcile human perception with imported precision. The fatal mistake breathes in that refusal to let watchers smell of frankincense once more. In the mountain fortress of Van, Armenian stonemason Arshak Kevork carved embrasures so cannons could rotate more freely. Freshly chiseled tuff emitted a chalky scent, mingling with pine smoke from campfires below. Arshak etched secret marks along the base stones, indicating weak mortar he lacked lime to replace. The marks resemble stylized fish, simple and almost playful, yet they signal danger. When shells struck months later, walls cracked exactly where he had cautioned. Archaeologists identified the fish symbols in 2020, confirming resource shortages under siege. The fatal mistake thus leaves its fossil within stone, lines drawn by hands denied proper mortar. Each fish a muted complaint preserved in the wind-sanded wall. In Mecca, Sharifian courier Saad al-Turki copied intercepted orders onto palm leaf paper that smelled of dates and dust. He rolled the strips inside hollow prayer beads, which he delivered to Ottoman deserters joining the Arab revolt. The messages detailed faltering pay, shortages of horse feed, and divergent aims between Istanbul and local commanders. When Ottoman patrols captured some deserters, they found the hollow beads but never decoded the miniature script, mistaking it for decorative calligraphy. The beads, now in a museum case smelling faintly of cedar polish, prove that intelligence seeped through devotional objects while central authorities insisted on uniform loyalty. The fatal mistake is etched even in these palm fibers, fragile yet stubborn. On the Romanian front, sanitary inspector Peride Hanum dipped litmus strips into field wells, the paper turning lavender in water laced with river silt. She recorded bacterial counts beside notes about soldiers drinking brine to numb hunger. Her log, bound in blue buckram, documents boiling times, soap rations, and the salty smell of sweat-soaked uniforms steaming near campfires. Commanders skimmed the figures but highlighted her final remark: "Morale follows clean cups." They underlined it twice, as though morale could be ordered like soap. The wells continued to sicken regiments, and parade strips fluttered unnoticed into a leather pouch. Today those strips, brittle as moth wings, remind us that the fatal mistake spread through every ignored test tube and feverish night. In the railway workshops of Haydarpalna, apprentice Aydin Kural traced locomotive pistons with chalk that squeaked like tiny screams, marking stress fractures along iron that smelled of rust and coal. He photographed the fissures using a borrowed plate camera, then fixed the image in a solution reeking of vinegar and hyposulfite. The photograph shows a piston clawed with hairline cracks, yet the annotation from headquarters reads simply, "Continue service, no spare available." The piston later shattered near Adapazar, derailing a train carrying winter coats toward the Caucasus front. Survivors described a shower of sparks smelling of burnt sesame as the carriage overturned. Aydin's photograph, corners curled, stares silently from the workshop wall. The fatal mistake can be touched here, a fracture line chalked and ignored. In Paris, exiled Ottoman feminist Nezihe Mohideen composed essays on onion skin paper, thin enough to show the veins in her wrist when held to light. The pages smelled of lilac ink. She argued that dismissing women's logistical expertise, nurses, educators, clerks, had accelerated collapse. She cited letters from schoolmistresses who rationed lamp oil to keep classes open, only to see their budgets reassigned to ceremonial uniforms. French publishers declined to print her essays until 1925, but manuscripts circulated hand to hand, rustling softly in salons scented with Gauloise smoke. The fatal mistake thus includes silenced warnings from those expected to bandage wounds without questioning their cause. During the Armistice occupation, Italian naval officer Carlo Maffei toured Ottoman depots, his leather gloves smelling of tar and cologne. He noted in his diary that the lathes were coated in fine coal dust untouched for months, and that the presses still held unfinished shells stamped with half-formed crescents. Carlo pocketed a brass shavings handful, writing that it felt warm, as if the machine still believed in orders. Those shavings, stored in a glass vial, glimmer under museum lights. They speak of inertia halted mid-spin, the fatal mistake lingering like static in idle machinery. Even the silence after surrender has texture, oily, metallic, patient. Meanwhile, in the Anatolian hinterland, Pastor Jacques Demir recorded sermons delivered in barns smelling of straw and kerosene. His leather-bound journal intertwined scripture with inventory, jars of quince jam traded for rifle parts, bolts of linen exchanged for cartridges. He chronicled how villagers debated whether the fatal mistake was spiritual pride or material neglect. Under one winter entry, he glued a feather from a migrating crane, brittle now, symbolizing a wish to carry burdens elsewhere. British patrols seized parts of the journal, yet the section about crane feathers survived because it stuck to the cover and resisted prying fingers. The fatal mistake hovers in these barns, in prayers muttered over ration tallies. At the League of Nations in Geneva, translator Fatih Rami ensured Ottoman debt negotiations were rendered into French without losing nuance. He filed each session's transcript in folders scented with Swiss pine, labelling them with fountain pen strokes that loop gracefully. He inserted footnotes referencing Ottoman parliamentary debates long suppressed, thereby slipping rediscovery into diplomatic files. When the minutes were declassified in 1988, scholars found his annotations carrying the faint aroma of pine and ink. They show how the fatal mistake kept echoing through financial restructuring, debts settled in whispers rather than drums. Fatih's elegant loops remind readers that even in exile, bureaucrats tried to balance ledgers of memory. Back in Istanbul, 1932, radio technician Suat Uzbey calibrated transmitters on the third floor of the new broadcasting house, the room smelling of hot tubes and beeswax polish. He built a late-night program titled Soundings of the Straits, overlaying boat horns with readings from newly published diaries of telegraphists. Static crackled like distant rain as he recited casualty tables in a lullaby cadence. Government censors initially frowned, but audience letters folded crisply, scented with attar or tobacco, arrived pleading for more. Swat kept a scrapbook, now faded, of those letters, each referencing the fatal mistake as though it were a relative needing gentle acknowledgement. The broadcast's tapes hissed softly when replayed, carrying both warning and comfort. During World War II, neutral Turkey stored wartime volumes in underground vaults, ventilated by ducts that exhaled air smelling of iron. Librarian Hurriyet Altan scrubbed mildew off Ottoman files using a paste of lemon juice and rice flour. The paste dried into a chalky crust she brushed away with goat hair brushes. One folder contained Enver Pasha's penciled calculations for Caucasus offensives, complete with doodles of cavalry plumes. Hurriyet noticed the eraser crumbs still trapped along the fold, as though indecision clung there. She wrote a secret note to future researchers: even in pencil, ambition leaves residue. The fatal mistake lingers within these crumbs, stubborn and grey, refusing to be entirely brushed off. In 1960s Berlin, Turkish guest workers formed a history circle called Sessiz Telgraph, meeting in a laundry room perfumed with detergents. They brought photocopies of Ottoman dispatches and retold family stories over clinking tea glasses. A reel-to-reel recorder captured their discussions in soft Turkish punctuated by German exclamations. They debated whether the fatal mistake warned migrants about trusting distant promises. The tapes, stored in a biscuit tin, were rediscovered by a granddaughter who digitized the hiss and hum. Listening today, one hears machines rumbling in the background like muted artillery, bridging past and present through the rhythm of washers and whispers. In 1987, photographer Gönül Tan overlapped negatives of the telegraph spool with shots of modern Istanbul traffic, developing the composite in trays that smelled of fixer and seaweed. Light trails from cars formed luminous Morse codes cascading over the copper bruise. Her exhibit, displayed in a darkened warehouse, flooded the floor with recorded harbour sounds. Visitors walked barefoot on warmed metal plates to feel conduction through their soles. Reviews praised the piece's tenderness, noting that the fatal mistake's texture could now be sensed, not just seen. Several days later, municipal inspectors nearly shut the exhibit for lacking permits, but public support kept it open. The gallery still reverberates with soft clicks when empty. As the Cold War thawed, diplomat Sevgi Baydar opened sealed Ottoman dossiers at the Foreign Ministry, using a bone folder that smelled of beeswax and old leather. She discovered correspondence between Enver Pasha and American envoy Henry Morgenthau, margins filled with hurried pencil sketches of troop positions. Sevgi copied the sketches onto tracing paper, observing that Enver's lines jittered during moments of stress. She correlated hand tremors with dates of telegraph spikes, building an unusual neurological portrait of the fatal mistake. Her report suggested that policy might be read through calligraphic nerves. The bone folder, smoothed from years of use, rests beside the file, quietly paying homage to hands that shook. In 2008, satellite analyst Okan Sawyer overlaid modern elevation data onto century-old reconnaissance maps. His workstation smelled of plastic and burnt dust from cooling fans. The software emitted gentle bells each time misalignments appeared. Okan color-coded supply routes that modern algorithms deemed impossible given terrain, painting them in translucent hues like auroras draped across Anatolia. He realized that commanders had drawn arrows unconstrained by ridges and ravines. He published a digital atlas showing the fatal mistake as a geography of wishful thinking, every unfeasible gradient glowing softly on screen. Users reported feeling seasick watching the animation. The land itself seemed to mourn the forces forced upon it. During 2015 commemorations at Chunuk Bair, Maori percussionists shared the stage with Turkish knee players, their instruments releasing scents of polished wood and flax oil. Historian Piri Teirangi read from Ottoman diaries translated into Tereo Maori, blending syllables like woven mats. Audiences sat on cushions brushed with eucalyptus mist, inhaling a hybrid memory. The dual narratives emphasized that the fatal mistake rippled outward, binding communities through shared loss and respect. Later, droplets from a passing shower dotting the stage resembled Morse dots, tiny wet testimonies clinging to drumheads. The collaboration recorded new memories that hum like low tide. In a Gorim cave hotel converted into a conference space, geologists and historians convened to analyze lead isotopes in Ottoman bullets. The room smelled of damp stone and breakfast simmet. Microdrills whined softly as they sampled projectiles excavated from Gallipoli trenches. Results showed alloy ratios consistent with emergency smelting of church bells and household goods. Historians matched these findings with requisition orders scribbled in frantic script. The fatal mistake thus protrudes even from metallurgical signatures, audible in microdrill vibrations, and the faint ring once sounded by bells that now rest silent, recast into desperate munitions. In 2022, poet Rana Diran hosted a midnight poetry vigil at Haydarpasa Station, candles perfuming the platform with beeswax and clove. Participants whispered verses derived from archival footnotes, transforming casualty tallies into rhythmic laments. A projection mapped the 1.7mm warp onto the station's vaulted ceiling, the curve expanding until it resembled a crescent moon. Train wheels clacked distantly, echoing heartbeats. Attendees traced the projection with fingertips against cool marble, feeling history's curvature under their skin. Rana's program booklet, printed on translucent rice paper, warned that the fatal mistake persists whenever numbers lose their humanity. Wind lifted the pages in gentle waves, making the text flutter like breath. Finally, in the present hush of the Naval Museum's sub-basement, a small device rests beside the copper spool, a haptic pad programmed to replay archival pressure data whenever fingertips hover above its surface. When activated, the pad warms slightly, releasing a faint aroma of solder and lemon oil. Users feel a subtle dip, precisely 1.7mm, accompanied by a whispered overlay of telegraph clicks, heartbeat samples, and ocean swells. The program cycles through sensory fragments gathered from all the documents, instruments, and testimonies we have traced. Lavender wards, frankincense watches, beet-stained weather charts, olive-dusted ledgers, jasmine observatories, petrol-soaked repair yards. Each vibration insists that the fatal mistake is not a single thunderclap, but a collage of overlooked textures. As palms hover above the pad, the museum lights dim, and the compressor's sigh blends with imagined surf. The copper spool, the ration chit, the mylar sleeve, the haptic pad all listen together, inviting us to breathe slowly, to honour data as sensation, and to let the night cradle history without repeating its fractured rhythm.